Imagine sitting in the seat. Your son bought you a first-class seat on a flight across the Atlantic. Now, imagine being told to get up, to move, simply because someone else thinks they deserve it more. This is the story of Celia Warren, a quiet, dignified retired librarian who never expected a simple airplane seat to become the battleground for respect, power, and justice. When flight attendants insist she switch seats for a white passenger, what happens next changes everything, not just for her, but for an entire airline, and a powerful CEO's son who refuses to stay silent. What drives a mother to stand firm in the face of humiliation? How far can one phone call ripple through the corridors of corporate power? And why does a simple act of dignity carry such seismic consequences in a world still grappling with race, privilege, and belonging? This is more than a story about a flight. It's about humanity, about justice that demands to be heard, and about the courage to say no. If you want to hear the full story of Celia Warren and the fight that shook an industry, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Let's dive into the story. The golden hue of the California sunrise poured through the tall glass windows of the Aerosky Premier Lounge at LAX. Beyond the glass, planes coasted silently along glistening runways like mechanical swans. Inside the lounge, travelers moved with quiet affluence, sipping sparkling water, adjusting tailored blazers, and tapping away at sleek laptops. Celia Warren sat in the corner of the lounge, hands folded neatly over her lap, her posture as refined as her presence. She wore a soft blue cardigan over a pressed cream blouse, a pair of black slacks she had ironed twice the night before, and modest leather flats that had carried her through decades of patient endurance. Her hair was a crown of coiled silver, pulled back with the grace of someone who knew how to carry herself with quiet dignity. A single strand of pearls, a gift from her late husband, rested against her collarbone. In her lap lay her boarding pass, first class, seat 1A. She still couldn't believe it. Celia had flown economy once, years ago, for a teaching conference in Denver. But this was another world. Her son, Brandon, had insisted. She had protested at first. The ticket price alone had made her feel breathless. But Brandon, her only child, would not hear it. "You've spent your life giving, Ma," he had said on the phone, voice warm and gentle. "Just this once. Let me give you the world back. Paris is waiting for you." She had smiled through tears that morning when the car arrived at her small house in Pasadena. The driver wore white gloves and called her Mrs. Warren. She had almost told him to just call her Celia, but something in his respectful tone made her pause. Maybe, just this once, she could let herself belong in a space she had never dared imagine. Celia took a careful sip of orange juice. She didn't trust the champagne offered earlier. A life of modesty was hard to shake. She glanced around the lounge. A man in a suit discussed oil stocks with a woman wearing aviator sunglasses indoors. Two younger passengers giggled over luxury travel points, and then her eyes landed on a woman across the room, tall, blonde, clad in an all-white designer pantsuit that shimmered faintly under the soft overhead lights. She held a phone to her ear, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the lounge without being technically rude. "No, I said c'est vrai, not Saint-Germain." She snapped into the phone. "If the suite doesn't overlook the Seine, it's pointless." She rolled her eyes and flicked her wrist, and the diamonds on her bracelet caught the light like a tiny flashbulb. Her eyes scanned the room dismissively and paused on Celia. Just for a moment. The look was quick but unmistakable. Celia knew that look. She had seen it on saleswomen in expensive stores, on school board members who forgot her name, on neighbors who smiled but never waved. Dismissal, not of what she had done, but of who she was. She lowered her eyes and reached for the small leather handbag beside her. Brandon had bought it for her last Christmas. He had told her it was Italian leather. She didn't care for brands, but she loved that he had thought of her. A soft chime sounded above. Boarding call for Aerosky Flight 382 to Paris Charles de Gaulle. First class and priority passengers. Please proceed to Gate 12. Celia took a steady breath, gathered her things, and rose. Her legs trembled slightly, not from age, but from the sheer surrealness of the moment. She walked toward the gate, offering a polite nod to the attendant with the scanner. The young woman looked at the boarding pass. Her smile dimmed ever so slightly before returning to full wattage. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am." Celia noticed the flicker, but said nothing. She was used to flickers. She walked the jet bridge with her chin lifted, trying to tamp down the mixture of joy and apprehension brewing in her chest. As she stepped onto the aircraft, a male flight attendant greeted her. "Good morning. Welcome aboard. First class is to your left." She nodded and walked forward into a cabin that could have been a private room in a five-star hotel. She stopped in front of 1A. It wasn't a seat, it was a suite. Smooth beige leather, warm wood paneling, a champagne glass waiting on a tiny tray table. She gingerly placed her bag in the overhead bin and sank into the plush seat. She exhaled slowly. The cushions welcomed her like an embrace. Celia reached for her phone and sent a message to Brandon Brand. "This seat is like a tiny hotel room in the sky. I feel like royalty." His reply came within seconds. "You are royalty. Love you. Ma. Enjoy every second." She smiled and tucked her phone into the pocket of her cardigan. For a moment, she let herself breathe. She looked out the oval window at the wing, basked in morning light, and whispered a soft prayer of gratitude. Then a shadow passed across the aisle. Whitney Blake, the woman from the lounge. She strutted into the cabin with the force of someone who believed in her own entitlement. Her heels clicked softly on the carpet. She glanced at the seat numbers. Her eyes fell on Celia. Her face froze. Celia felt the weight of the stare and looked up with a gentle smile. "Good morning." Whitney didn't respond. Instead, she pulled out her boarding pass and stared at it, then back at Celia. "You're in the wrong seat," she said flatly. Celia blinked. "Pardon me. This is seat 1A. I always fly 1A. My assistant books it months ahead. There must be some mix-up." Celia reached into her bag and pulled out her own pass. She offered it, polite but firm. 1A, it's what I was assigned." Whitney's lip curled. "Barely. I'll get someone." She turned on her heel, flagging down the lead flight attendant, a tall woman with immaculate posture and a practiced smile. Her name tag read Allison. As they spoke in hushed tones, Celia felt her stomach twist, not in fear, in familiarity. She had been here before, not on a plane, but in that space, the one where people decide who belongs and who doesn't. The space where someone like her, despite paying the same price, is suddenly questioned, invalidated. She sat perfectly still, back straight, hands folded again in her lap. She would not shrink. Not again. Not today. Celia Warren sat perfectly still in her seat, her back straight against the curved leather pod that was supposed to be a cocoon of comfort. Her eyes remained on the window, watching the sunlight slip across the tarmac, though her mind had already begun preparing for something else, a conversation, an explanation, a confrontation she had not invited but could already feel brewing around her like a cold front. The sound of soft footsteps approached. Celia turned slightly. It was the flight attendant from earlier, the tall one with the smooth bun and practiced grace. Her name tag read Allison. She was flanked by the same woman from the gate, Whitney Blake, whose arms were now folded tightly across her pristine blazer. "Ma'am," Allison began, her voice sweet and smooth. "I just want to double-check your seat information. Sometimes our system shuffles assignments during last-minute updates." Celia calmly handed her boarding pass. She had nothing to hide. Her fingers remained steady, though the air around her felt less warm now, less welcoming. Allison's eyes flicked across the ticket. Her smile never left her lips, but it stiffened, just a touch. "Well," she said, "I do see 1A listed here, but it's possible a minor system error occurred during check-in. It happens occasionally." Whitney interjected with an exasperated sigh. "I don't care what the paper says. I've been flying 1A on this route for 6 years. My assistant books it. Everyone knows I prefer the bulkhead for the leg room. The manifest must have had me first. That's why I was delayed at security today." Something clearly glitched. Celia turned her gaze slowly toward Whitney. There was no anger in her eyes, only a quiet challenge, a test of civility. "I understand," Celia said, her voice calm. "But I was assigned this seat. My son booked it directly with your airline months ago. I boarded on time, and I've been sitting here peacefully." Allison glanced between the two women. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her professional posture unbothered. But there was something calculating behind her eyes, something that said she was trying to figure out which woman to placate. "Ms. Blake," Allison said carefully, "perhaps I can offer you 6A or 3D. We do have a few other open seats in the forward cabin." Whitney's jaw dropped slightly. She looked as though Allison had asked her to ride in the cargo hold. "I am not being bumped for someone who just happened to slip in here first." "Are you kidding me?" Celia felt the tension thicken, pressing in on her ribs, but she remained composed. She folded her hands in her lap again and said nothing. Allison's tone shifted. "Mrs. Warren," she said, subtly softening the honorific, "if you would be willing to move to 6D, we'd be grateful. It's still first class, of course. Just a different position. Still first class, just somewhere else." Celia tilted her head slightly, as though hearing the words through another filter. She could feel something tight and familiar wrapping around her chest. That feeling, that whisper from another time. From grocery stores where she was asked to open her bag at the register. From academic panels where her voice was ignored until someone else repeated it louder. And now, at 73 years old, flying for the first time in the seat her son had proudly given her, she was being asked to give it up, not for protocol, not for safety, but because someone else insisted they were more entitled to it. "No, thank you," Celia replied simply. "I'll remain in my assigned seat." There was a silence, and then came the voice of another crew member, a man, mid-30s, with a trimmed beard and blue epaulets. His name tag read Mark. He approached with a slight edge of authority, as if summoned to manage a difficult passenger. "Good morning," he said, nodding toward both women. "What seems to be the issue here," Allison explained in soft tones. Mark frowned and turned to Celia. Mrs. Warren, we've had some confusion in our reservation system. It seems this seat was double assigned. Our apologies, but for the smooth operation of the flight, we'd ask if you wouldn't mind relocating to 6D. We'd like to avoid delay. There it was. The pressure disguised as politeness. Avoid delay, cooperation, temporary error. These were the words that allowed systems to flex rules for the privileged while pressing others into submission. Celia blinked slowly. Her voice was still gentle, but firmer now. I'm sorry, but I was assigned 1A. I boarded on time. I've done nothing wrong, and I do not intend to move. Mark's brows lifted slightly, not expecting resistance. Whitney huffed behind him. This is ridiculous. You're making a scene out of nothing. She's being difficult on purpose. Celia's eyes never left Mark's face. I am not being difficult. I am asserting my right to stay in the seat my son paid for. Mark leaned in just slightly. Ma'am, please understand. If you delay the flight, the captain may have to get involved. We're just trying to keep things on track for all passengers. Celia felt something twist in her stomach. Her eyes scanned the cabin. Other passengers had begun to notice. Some were pretending to look elsewhere. A few watched her directly, eyes filled with curiosity or quiet judgment, and in that moment she felt very small. For a second, she considered giving in, just standing up, moving back to 6D, and letting the whole thing pass. It wasn't that far away. The seat would still recline. She could still get to Paris. But another voice rose in her mind, one she had carried her entire life, one that had taught her how to hold her head high when her students' parents talked down to her, one that reminded her of the long nights patching Brandon's jacket because they couldn't afford a new one. She didn't know where this was going, but she knew she wasn't going to retreat. She reached down into her purse and pulled out her phone. If you'll excuse me, she said softly, I'd like to make a quick phone call before we proceed. Allison frowned. Ma'am, we really need to close the doors. Celia didn't respond. She simply tapped Brandon's number. It was marked with a gold star on her favorites list. The phone rang twice. He picked up. Hey, Ma, Brandon said, warm as ever. You boarded okay. She drew a shaky breath and steadied it with all her strength. I did, but we have a bit of a situation. And then everything began to shift. Brandon Warren didn't usually answer his phone during high-level strategy calls, especially not while standing in front of a glass wall overlooking the San Francisco skyline, presenting Neural Core Systems' AI governance model to a room full of world leaders and corporate power players. But the moment he saw his mother's name flash across his screen, his tone shifted without a beat. He raised a hand subtly to his COO, Sarah Young. Pause here for a moment, he said softly, handing her the clicker. She understood immediately. He stepped away from the podium and answered, Hey, Ma, everything okay? There was a short silence on the other end. Then her voice came through, gentle and low, but laced with something he recognized instantly. Embarrassment? Brandon, I hate to bother you. I know you're working, but I think there's been a problem with my seat. He stepped into the hallway outside the conference room and closed the door behind him. Tell me what happened, he said, voice calm but now stripped of all business polish. She explained it slowly, the arrival of the other passenger, the assumption that Celia had taken the wrong seat, the subtle pressure, the refusal to look her in the eye, and then the tone change when she wouldn't move. That phrase, "we may need to involve the captain," clung to his mind like oil. He did not interrupt her once, but his eyes had gone cold. "You're standing right now?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "They said if I didn't move, they'd have to delay the flight. Did you move? I told them I wanted to make a quick call first." His jaw flexed, quiet fury radiating behind his composed tone. "Good. That's good. Ma, stay right where you are. Don't move an inch. You did the right thing. Let me handle it from here. All right. But please don't make a fuss. It's probably nothing." He gave a small, humorless chuckle. "You're my mother. It is absolutely something. Give me 5 minutes." She exhaled slowly. "I trust you." He hung up and immediately turned to Sarah, who had been waiting just down the hall. "Get Harold Kramer on the line. Right now. Use my line and loop me in." "Understood," she said, already dialing as they walked toward Brandon's private office. Inside the room, Brandon shut the door and walked to the large oak desk beneath a framed photo of Celia holding his hand at his college graduation. His expression hardened. "This is not about a seat," he muttered. "It never is." Sarah held out the phone. "He's on." Brandon lifted it to his ear. "Harold," he said. A nervous voice responded. "Brandon. Is everything all right?" "No, it isn't. My mother, Celia Warren, boarded Aero Sky Flight 382 this morning. First class, seat 1A, booked under the Neural Core corporate account, booked months ago. She's now being asked to move for another passenger, a white passenger, a louder passenger. Oh, God." Harold breathed. "Who told her to move? Your crew? Your flight purser? Your lead attendant? And I assume your gate agent had a hand in it, too. My mother is 73 years old. Harold. She was publicly challenged in front of an entire cabin of passengers. On a ticket purchased with the $68 million account I bring to your airline." Harold stammered, I had no idea this happened. Let me call the station lead. I'll know." Brandon cut him off. "You're going to do exactly as I say. First, you will contact your CEO, Gregory Langston. Let him know the Neural Core account is frozen pending a full review. Not paused, frozen. Second, you will ensure that Flight 382 does not move 1 inch until my mother is returned to her seat. Not later. Not mid-flight. Right now. Third, the captain himself will apologize to her, publicly, in front of the passengers who watched this happen. And finally, the crew members involved, Allison Shore and Mark Fennell, are to have no further interaction with my mother for the remainder of the flight. I want a printed list of crew names on my desk before wheels up." There was dead silence on the line. Then a faint, "Understood." Brandon ended the call and looked out over the skyline. His heart pounded not with rage, but with purpose. He remembered all the nights his mother had come home from the library with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. The nights she read to him, even when her voice was hoarse. The winter she went without a coat so he could have one for school. This wasn't about status. This was about the way the world quietly discounted people like his mother. Not loudly, not directly, just enough to erode their right to comfort, to respect, to presence. He would not let that slide. Not for anyone. Back on the plane, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had changed. The murmurs had died down, but an invisible current buzzed beneath every polite smile and seat adjustment. Celia remained standing by seat 1A, one hand resting gently on the backrest. Her phone was still in her hand, though the call had ended. Whitney Blake was seated 2 rows behind her now, visibly annoyed, tapping impatiently on her phone and sighing every few minutes with dramatic flair. Mark Fennell and Allison stood near the galley, speaking in hushed tones. "She's refusing to move," Mark said, his voice sharp with frustration. "This could delay us 20 minutes or more." "She's polite about it," Allison replied, "but firm, like she knows something. She probably thinks she's making a point." Allison frowned. "There's something off about this. Did you see the way she looked at me? Not angry, just disappointed. I don't know. It made me feel." The overhead line buzzed sharply. Mark turned toward the cockpit. The captain was waving him over urgently. He walked forward and ducked inside. The captain, a graying man with a clipped British accent, looked pale. "Just got a direct call from ground ops," he said. "We have a priority instruction. Flight is to be held at the gate until we receive confirmation of passenger reintegration." Mark blinked. "I'm sorry. Passenger reintegration, passenger in seat 1A, Mrs. Celia Warren. I've just been informed by corporate that she is the mother of Brandon Warren." Mark's face drained of color, as in neural core. Brandon Warren. The captain nodded gravely. "Not only that, the company has frozen the account pending internal review. $68 million. Mark. The message from Langston's office said, quote, "Fix it now or don't fly." The words hit like bricks. Mark turned slowly and stepped out of the cockpit. Allison met him just outside. "What happened?" she asked. "Get the captain," he muttered. "He's handling this. We're done." A moment later, the captain stepped out. His expression was calm but serious. He walked past the galley, past the whispering passengers, and straight to Celia. She looked up as he approached. "Mrs. Warren," he said, his voice audible across the cabin. "On behalf of Aerosky International, I offer you our most sincere apologies. What happened to you today was inexcusable, and I would like to personally escort you back to your seat." Celia blinked. She had not expected this. Whitney looked up in confusion. Mark and Allison stood frozen, the reality of their mistake sinking in, and for the first time since boarding, the cabin fell into absolute silence. Celia's hand gripped the leather headrest. She glanced at the seat, at the captain, and then slowly turned to the passengers watching her. She opened her mouth to speak. Celia Warren's hand remained gently resting on the top of seat 1A. Her fingers curled over the leather as if steadying herself against a gust of wind no one else could see. The captain of Aerosky Flight 382 stood before her, waiting for a response to his carefully worded apology. His voice had been respectful, his tone composed, but Celia could sense the tension behind his eyes. It was the kind of tension that came from orders passed down with urgency and the weight of dollars attached to every syllable. Around them, the cabin was silent. The ambient hum of the aircraft was the only sound. She looked slowly to the seat, the same one she had sunk into just moments ago with joy in her chest and her son's message still fresh on her screen. She thought of the champagne glass that had been taken away mid-conflict, the offer of orange juice instead, the glance from the purser, the silence from other passengers. The moment Whitney Blake had announced, not asked, that this was her seat. Now they wanted to give it back. Now that they knew, her voice was steady as she spoke. "I appreciate your apology, Captain," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "Truly, but I will not be taking this seat." The captain blinked, his lips parting. "Mrs. Warren," he said, lowering his voice but keeping it audible. "Please reconsider. We recognize the mistake. I'm here to make it right. You are more than welcome to reclaim your place." Celia offered him a small, graceful smile. "You are kind to say so, but I was not welcome 5 minutes ago, and I have no interest in being tolerated only now that someone made a call." A ripple passed through the cabin like the subtle tremor of an earthquake. Whitney Blake, seated now in 3A, let out an audible exhale of disbelief. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered. Celia ignored her. "Captain," she continued, her voice now softer but no less firm. "Respect is not something that can be retrieved like misplaced luggage. I was not asked to move because of a system glitch. I was asked to move because someone looked at me and decided I did not belong here. That decision was supported, quietly and with a smile. That is the part I cannot sit back down for." The captain swallowed hard. Across the cabin, a man seated in 2C turned slightly. His face was thoughtful, a notebook now resting on his lap. Celia noticed but said nothing. The captain cleared his throat. "I understand your point, Mrs. Warren. I truly do. But I ask you again to please reconsider. We are under a delay. We would very much like to depart. A private vehicle has been arranged for you upon landing. You will receive our highest level of care and service." She looked at him for a long time, then shook her head. "The time to care for me was earlier. Not now." Behind the captain, Mark Fennell stood like a ghost, eyes fixed on a point beyond her shoulder. Allison Shore was still near the galley, hands clenched around a tablet she had stopped pretending to read. Celia turned toward the door. "I would like to deplane," she said simply. The captain hesitated. "You are certain?" "Yes," she said. Her voice was like glass, clear, unyielding. The captain nodded slowly, then turned toward Mark. "Retrieve her, carry on. Now." Mark moved without a word, without meeting her eyes. He opened the overhead bin and carefully removed her bag, placing it beside her seat. Celia reached for it and pulled the strap over her shoulder. "Thank you, Captain," she said with quiet dignity. "I wish you a safe and pleasant journey," he replied, but she was already walking. As she moved through the aisle, she could feel eyes on her. Some were sympathetic, some were unsure. A few were wide with discomfort, like people watching a building being demolished while still standing inside it. Whitney didn't say a word as Celia passed her, but her posture screamed of wounded pride and hollow victory. At the front of the aircraft, the door was still open. Sunlight spilled onto the jet bridge like a path. A female agent stood there, startled to see a first-class passenger exiting. "Mrs. Warren?" the woman asked. Celia nodded. "My son has arranged for other accommodations." She stepped off the plane without another glance back. On the tarmac, a sleek black car was already waiting. The driver stepped forward, a young man in a dark suit holding a small sign with her name. He opened the door without question and helped her inside. The interior smelled of fresh leather and citrus polish. On the seat beside her was a small card with her name in gold ink. "Welcome, Mrs. Warren. We hope your journey to Paris is peaceful and dignified. Brandon." She smiled, not because of the luxury, but because of the care. That was what made it different. It wasn't about compensation, it was about restoration. The driver pulled away from the terminal, headed not toward the main airport but toward a private terminal at the far end of the runway. Back on Flight 382, Whitney adjusted herself in seat 3A and signaled for a flight attendant. Mark approached slowly. "Yes, Ms. Blake." She tilted her head slightly, trying to wear the same confidence she had before. "Can I get a refill of my champagne?" Mark didn't respond immediately. "I'll see what we have left." He walked away. Allison stepped in to take over. Her hands were trembling slightly as she poured the drink. Whitney noticed. "What's wrong with all of you? You'd think someone died." Allison forced a smile. "We're just short-staffed this morning." Across the aisle, the man in 2C, Nathan O'Hara, lifted his notebook again. He began to write, slowly, intentionally. His fingers scratched along the page like a musician finding rhythm. He had watched it all, not with judgment, but with fascination. What began as a simple misunderstanding had unfolded into a quiet rebellion, one waged without raised voices or dramatic gestures. Just a woman with poise and a son who knew her worth. He leaned back in his chair and underlined a sentence at the top of the page. "The dignity to walk away at the private terminal." Celia stepped onto the tarmac where a sleek Gulfstream jet was being prepped. The crew smiled warmly, but without pity. She was escorted up the stairs with grace. Inside, soft music played. A linen-covered seat awaited her. A steward brought her a cup of tea. Not champagne. It was exactly what she wanted. Celia looked out the window as her previous flight taxied away in the distance. She thought of everything that had happened in the last hour. The shame, the strength it had taken to stay standing, the moment she picked up the phone, and the feeling of leaving that plane not as someone who was dismissed, but as someone who had decided her own exit. She sipped her tea, folded her hands again, and closed her eyes. She felt peace. Not because someone had finally seen her, but because she had refused to go unseen. As the private jet lifted into the sky with Celia Warren comfortably seated on board, Flight 382 remained grounded at Gate 14B. The cabin lights had dimmed slightly, but the mood was anything but calm. In first class, silence spread like fog. Whitney Blake sat in seat 3A, legs crossed sharply, tapping her fingernails against her phone. She had stopped making eye contact with the other passengers. Mark Fennell and Allison Shore remained near the galley, speaking in clipped whispers. From his seat in 2C, Nathan O'Hara watched it all unfold with the quiet observation of a man used to writing about people who didn't realize they were being watched. Mark had passed the message on to Allison without saying much. His tone was hollow. His energy had shifted. The last hour had stripped something from him. "They're pulling the plug," he had said under his breath. Allison blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean the Neural Core corporate account. Gone, suspended, frozen." Her throat tightened. Because of her, Mark gave a bitter nod. "Because of what we did to her." Allison looked away. Her face had drained of color. She stared at the galley wall for several seconds. Then she walked away, stiff and slow, like someone heading into a storm. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner suite of Neural Core Systems headquarters in San Francisco, Brandon Warren stood alone in front of a wide floor-to-ceiling window. The city below bustled on with indifference, but Brandon was not indifferent. Not today. He had made a dozen calls already. The fallout was underway. His assistant had called ahead to the private jet service. Celia was in the air, en route to Paris, with a trained all-black crew Brandon personally handpicked from their executive travel partner. She would arrive earlier, more comfortably, with peace and space to breathe. But Brandon's expression held no peace. He was thinking about her voice on the phone, steady but shaken. He was thinking about how often women like his mother were asked to make room, to step aside, to cooperate for the convenience of others. And now, today, because someone had misjudged her, underestimated her, tried to displace her from a seat she had every right to occupy, there would be consequences. His office door cracked open. Sarah Young stepped in. She didn't speak right away. She waited for his signal. Brandon turned to her. "Did you get him?" "Yes. He's calling back in 2 minutes." But I spoke directly to his aide. "Gregory Langston knows what's coming." Brandon gave a curt nod. "And they're in damage control. PR team is on standby. Legal is already spinning up drafts." "Good," Brandon said. "Then we can stop pretending this is an internal matter. They'll understand that this isn't about money. It's about accountability." Sarah hesitated. "Are you sure you want to go public?" He turned back to the window. "I'm sure I don't, but I will. If they make me." His phone buzzed. Unknown number, but he knew exactly who it was. He picked up. "Langston," came a voice. "Brandon, first of all, let me just say how horrified we are at this. Absolutely mortified. This is not who we are." Brandon said nothing. Langston continued, rushing ahead. "This crew, this situation, this is an anomaly. We are launching an internal investigation. We will have those responsible disciplined immediately. If your mother is still at the airport, I'd be honored to send a team to—" "She's not at the airport," Brandon said, voice sharp and clean. "She's in the air, on a private jet, paid for by me, because your crew made her feel unsafe and unwelcome on a flight she had every right to enjoy." "Brandon, I understand how serious this looks, and we want to make it right." Brandon closed his eyes for a beat. "My mother's name is Celia Warren. She spent her entire life giving more than she took. She raised me alone while working 2 jobs. She gave this country 60 years of service as a librarian, mentor, volunteer, and educator. And today, your airline told her without saying a word that she didn't belong in the front of the plane." Langston took a shallow breath. "You have my sincerest apologies." "I don't want your apologies," Brandon replied. "I want action, not just firings. I want culture change, starting at the gate and ending at your boardroom." There was a pause. "What are you asking for?" Brandon's voice remained even, but every word was steel. "You will fire the 2 crew members involved, Allison Shore and Mark Fennell. You will also terminate the gate agent, Tanya Rhodes. I want those terminations confirmed in writing before end of day. Second, you will release a public statement, not a vague regret, a real one. It will detail what happened on Flight 382 and why. It will use words like racial bias and discrimination, not inconvenience." Langston sputtered. "That could devastate our brand." Brandon did not waver. "What happened to my mother could devastate your humanity. Your brand is already wounded. This is your one shot at dignity." Langston was silent again. Brandon pressed on. "Third, you will undergo a full overhaul of your DEI training, not one of those 2-hour videos, a full curriculum, designed and monitored by a third-party consultancy of my choosing. Your executive team will take it, your pilots will take it, your lounge staff will take it, no exceptions." Langston sounded weary. "This is going to cost us millions." Brandon's reply came quiet and cold. It cost my mother her dignity. It's costing you $68 million today. Do you understand me? I do. One more thing, Brandon added. Langston waited. There will be no NDA. If this ever leaks to the press, I won't stop it. I won't even comment. But I won't protect you either. You either walk into this with humility, or you collapse under your own arrogance. I don't care which path you choose. Langston spoke carefully now. I hear you. We'll do what you ask. Brandon exhaled. Good. He ended the call without another word. Sarah stepped forward again. Do you want me to draft a holding statement in case media picks this up before they do? Brandon shook his head. No. Let it simmer. If we speak too soon, they'll call it spin. But if we wait, and the truth comes from a witness, it'll carry more weight. He looked up at the screen on the wall, where a map showed the progress of Flight 382 still idling at the gate. Let them sit with it. On board. Whitney shifted uncomfortably. She opened Instagram, then closed it, then opened it again. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She glanced around. The air in first class was thick with discomfort. She could feel eyes brushing past her, avoiding her. She felt something she had not felt in years. Irrelevance. Mark was still pale. Allison stood with her arms crossed in the galley, blinking faster than normal. Nathan O'Hara, in 2C, scribbled a headline in his notebook. A seat, a system, and a stand. He underlined it once, then began to write. Aerosky Flight 382 was finally cleared for departure. But it felt more like a funeral procession than the beginning of a luxury transatlantic journey. Engines roared to life, but no one in first class was relaxed. No one laughed. No one toasted champagne. The seat Celia Warren had once occupied sat empty for nearly a minute before it was discreetly removed from booking availability. An assistant flight operations officer had come aboard, whispered something urgently to the purser, and just like that, all talk of system glitches and seat swaps stopped. The captain returned to the cockpit with clenched fists and tight shoulders. Allison Shore moved through the cabin slowly, silently. She did not make eye contact. She did not offer drinks. Her usual polished smile had vanished, replaced by a mechanical stare. She looked like someone trying to finish a job knowing it would be her last time wearing the uniform. Mark Fennell stood beside her briefly before whispering, "They're serious. Word from corporate is spreading. This isn't going away." Allison didn't respond. She just kept folding napkins that no one had requested. Further down the cabin, Whitney Blake shifted in her seat, glancing at her phone every few seconds as if waiting for it to buzz with news. But it didn't. The silence in her social world was almost louder than the silence around her. She opened her contacts, scrolled to her husband's name, hesitated, then locked the screen without typing anything. She looked across the aisle and caught the eye of the man in 2C. Nathan O'Hara nodded at her once. Not a greeting, a confirmation. He had seen her. He had seen everything. She turned away. Meanwhile, in the control tower of San Francisco's private executive airfield, a different plane had already crossed the coastline. Celia Warren leaned back in a cream-colored leather recliner. She held a porcelain teacup in both hands, the heat radiating comfort into her palms. The cabin was quiet. A soft jazz tune played from hidden speakers. A blanket rested gently across her lap. She wasn't thinking about revenge. She wasn't even thinking about justice. She was thinking about a garden back home, about how her mother used to teach her that pruning was necessary if you wanted anything to bloom. Respect had to be cultivated. She sipped her tea slowly. On her side table was a handwritten note from Brandon, written before takeoff. "I'm sorry this happened. Ma, I hate that it happened, but I am proud of you. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't fold. You stood and you walked. That's power. I'll see you soon. Paris will wait. Love you forever. Bran." She smiled. Then, without a word, she folded the note and tucked it into her purse next to a small photograph of Brandon when he was 6, holding a paper ribbon from a spelling bee. She closed her eyes and listened to the hum of the jet slicing through the sky. She felt safe. Back on Flight 382 halfway across the Atlantic, a message pinged onto the cockpit secure operations screen. The captain read it twice before calling Mark Fennell to the front. "Read this." Mark took the paper and scanned it. "Effective immediately. Upon arrival at Heathrow, flight attendant Allison Shore and purser Mark Fennell are to report directly to station manager's office. Do not report for returned flight. Terminations pending. Security will be present. Internal memo to follow." Mark stared at the page. It was brief, final, no ambiguity. His breath caught in his throat. "Captain," he whispered, "this can't be real. I've worked for this airline for 20 years. The captain didn't look up. "I'm sorry, Mark. There's nothing I can do." Allison came forward. She had seen Mark's face. She knew. He handed her the paper. Her eyes moved across it slowly, as if disbelief might rewrite the ink. Her hands began to shake. She sat down in the jump seat across from him. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The plane flew on. In row 2C, Nathan O'Hara opened his laptop. He had nearly a full column drafted already, written in the clear and piercing tone his readers expected. It was titled "The Sat That Exposed the Sky," but he paused, then deleted that title. Too obvious. He tapped his fingers on the keys, then began again. The cost of dignity at 30,000 feet. He didn't name names, not yet, but he described what he had seen, the subtle gestures, the shift in tone, the power dynamics, the silence of the witnesses, the arrogance of assumption, the way the woman he would only call her the passenger had held her composure without flinching. He described the moment she refused to return to her seat. He described the way it had made the air inside that aircraft feel different. He described, in careful prose, the unspoken architecture of class and race that often defined air travel more than any boarding pass. He knew he would receive backlash. He also knew it would be the most read piece of his career. On the ground. Aero Sky headquarters in New York was in triage mode. Gregory Langston had called an emergency board meeting. PR advisors lined the hallway outside his office, speaking rapidly into headsets. The decision had been made. The airline would comply with Brandon Warren's demands, but there was no hiding the truth anymore. A wave was coming, not just from Brandon, from public perception, from news outlets, from every person who had ever felt pushed back into a lower row because of someone else's expectations. Langston stood at the head of the conference room table and looked at his senior team. "We're not just fighting for a contract," he said. "We're fighting for the soul of this company." No one disagreed. Back on the plane, the crew prepared for landing. Allison gathered her things in silence. Her name badge sat loose in her pocket. Mark looked out the window, his expression blank. They had made a calculation. They had assumed the quiet older woman in seat 1A would move quietly. would cooperate, would not matter. They were wrong. It wasn't the seat. It was what the seat represented. It was the same reason why some people walked into rooms and were given the benefit of the doubt, while others had to prove themselves worthy of the space they had already earned. And now, because of one choice made in haste, they had lost everything. The plane touched down at Heathrow. Passengers rose slowly, no one speaking above a whisper. Whitney stood and checked her phone again. Her name had not yet gone viral, but something else had. A tweet from a tech blogger in premium economy had reached nearly 200,000 views. Just witnessed a black grandmother get kicked out of her first-class seat on my flight to London. Said nothing, didn't argue, then left with dignity. We're now 2 hours delayed. Something tells me this isn't over. Flight 382, Aero Sky, say her name. Whitney looked at it and felt her stomach drop. The replies were already filling up. Who was she? Post her name. Where's the crew? This happens too often. Whitney sat down again. Her ears rang. The ground hadn't caught up with the story yet, but it would. The hush in the cabin of Flight 382 lingered long after the wheels touched the runway. It was the kind of silence that followed not sleep or peace, but unease. A collective quiet laced with unspoken questions and lingering guilt. Passengers gathered their things with mechanical movements. Zippers pulled slowly. Coats unfolded without chatter. The usual rush to stand first, to reach the bins and claim overhead luggage, had been replaced by something more tentative. Whitney Blake sat in her seat, watching the others with thinly veiled tension. Her makeup had smudged slightly under her eyes, and her lips no longer carried their signature gloss. She clutched her designer tote like a shield. She glanced toward the front of the plane, where the seat that had caused all this seat 1A sat empty, cool, and untouched since Celia Warren had left it behind hours ago. Mark Fennell and Allison Shore were no longer pretending. They knew. They knew what awaited them when the cabin doors opened. It had arrived not with an announcement, but with silence. The crew had passed along the final memo after the captain's last communication. Neither Allison nor Mark said much after that. The paper was simple. Do not proceed to gate. Report directly to security office. Luggage will be held. HR presence required. Termination protocol in progress. There was no mistaking the intent. Allison stood in the galley, hands clasped in front of her, staring down at the floor. The once crisp lines of her uniform felt tight now, suffocating. Her breath caught each time the engines downshifted, each time the plane shuddered as it taxied toward the terminal. Mark sat at the crew seat by the forward door, elbows on knees, head lowered. He hadn't spoken since they began descent. They had been given one final task: remain professional through landing. It was a request, but it felt like a test. Allison took a steady breath and walked down the aisle one final time. She didn't offer snacks. She didn't smile. She simply moved, checking buckles, nodding when required. When she passed row 2C, Nathan O'Hara looked up at her. He said nothing, just one long, knowing look. Allison kept walking. She reached Whitney's row. Whitney turned slightly and offered a strained smile, the kind used between strangers on elevators. Allison paused. Yes, she asked, her voice softer than usual. Whitney hesitated, then said, I didn't mean for it to turn into this. Allison blinked once, then replied, Neither did I, and walked away. Meanwhile, on the ground, Celia Warren's plane had already landed nearly an hour ahead of Flight 382. She had been driven directly from the private terminal to a quiet hotel nestled in the 7th arrondissement of Paris. A historic building with warm brickwork and ivy climbing its exterior. It looked like a place where time had paused to catch its breath. Celia stood on the small balcony of her suite, looking out over the Parisian rooftops. The morning was still cool, the sky streaked with pale pink and gray. In the distance, bells from a nearby church echoed softly across the stones. She held a cup of tea in one hand and the embroidered robe around her with the other. Down below, a flower cart was being wheeled down the street. The vendor was arranging dahlias into buckets while humming to himself. Celia closed her eyes for a moment. She was not thinking of the flight anymore, not of the crew, not even of Whitney Blake. She was thinking about peace, about how often people let their joy be taken from them without realizing they had the right to hold on to it. She had almost surrendered hers, but something inside had said no. That no had cost others their comfort, but it had saved her own sense of self. The door to her suite opened behind her. Brandon's voice came through, warm and steady. "Room service is here. Ma, breakfast for a queen." She smiled, "Not turning yet. I already have my tea, but you don't have fresh croissants." Now she turned, and he was there, smiling, holding a tray with golden pastries, fresh fruit, and a small dish of jam. He placed it on the table by the window, then kissed her forehead gently. "You didn't have to fly out," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Brandon sat beside her. "I did. I wanted to walk through the gardens with you myself." She looked at him for a long moment. "You handled everything," she said, with such calm. He shrugged. "I just did what you taught me. Keep your voice steady. Let your actions do the talking." Celia reached out and took his hand. "I'm proud of you," she said. Brandon's eyes softened. "I'm proud of you too. Ma, you didn't let them take it from you. Take what's your place." She smiled faintly. It wasn't just the seat, Brandon, it was the moment. The chance to choose how I saw myself. He nodded. "And you chose well." They sat there in the morning light, not needing to speak further. Outside, Paris moved on. Back at Heathrow, security had arrived at the gate just as the last passengers stepped off Flight 382. They weren't wearing tactical gear or speaking loudly, but their presence was unmistakable. 2 uniformed men and 1 woman in a blazer stood at the jet bridge. Allison and Mark stepped forward together. The terminal lights above buzzed faintly. The walls felt too bright. "Ms. Sure, Mr. Fennel," the woman said, checking her tablet. "This way, please." Passengers exiting gave them brief glances. Most pretended not to see. Whitney Blake walked behind them, keeping her distance, adjusting her sunglasses even though there was no sun inside the terminal. As she passed the gate area, she heard a faint notification from her phone. She checked it. A new post. Someone had uploaded a blurry photo of the commotion at the plane's door, tagging the airline and mentioning the story. The comments below were piling up. One caught her eye. "Is this the same woman who threw a fit over a first-class seat on Flight 382? Heard the other passenger was the mother of a CEO? Imagine thinking your status means more than someone's dignity." Whitney's chest tightened. She opened her own Instagram. Several DMs were waiting. Most were not kind. She turned off the screen. For the first time in years, she had no idea how to control the narrative. And worse, she had no idea how to undo it. In the hallway leading to the operations room, Allison looked straight ahead. Her eyes didn't blink. Mark walked beside her, shoulders sagging. "I made the call," he whispered. "I know," she said. "I thought it would just be easier." "It usually is," she replied. They didn't speak again. The door ahead opened. A woman in an Aerosky blazer stood with a folder. Her expression was neither cruel nor kind. "Come in," she said. And then the door closed behind them. The door clicked shut behind Allison Shore and Mark Fennell. Inside the small, windowless room at Heathrow's operations wing, everything felt like a courtroom without a jury. A rectangular table sat in the center, 2 folders placed neatly at its edge. A woman from Aerosky's Human Resources Department waited, her expression neutral but firm. She gestured for them to sit. Neither spoke as they obeyed. "You both know why you're here," she began, flipping open one of the folders. "But let's be very clear about what's in motion." Mark tried to clear his throat but failed to find a voice. Allison simply folded her hands in her lap, her face pale, the lines around her eyes heavier than they'd looked hours ago. "The airline has initiated a formal termination review. A full internal audit is already underway. We've received statements from several passengers, as well as from the captain and your colleagues. Legal is involved." Allison's jaw clenched slightly. "I didn't intend for this to go that far. We were following procedure. The seat was double booked. That's what I was told. The HR rep didn't blink. You were told by whom Mark looked up then? It came from Tanya at the gate. Noted," the woman said, writing it down. "However, both of you exercised judgment in removing a confirmed passenger from her seat. A passenger who had boarding priority and documented assignment to seat 1A. She didn't complain," Mark said, almost in protest. "She just left, gracefully." "That's not a defense," the woman replied. "It's an indictment." The silence that followed was heavier than any turbulence they'd ever flown through. Meanwhile, in a conference suite at Aerosky's Manhattan headquarters, Gregory Langston stared at a tablet filled with trending headlines. Black CEO's mother removed from first-class seat airline in crisis. Aerosky faces reckoning after viral discrimination incident light 382 dignity in the aisle. Damage in the skies. Gregory set the tablet down and rubbed his temples. In all his years in corporate leadership, he had never seen a reputational landslide occur in real time like this. Sarah Young's face appeared on the wall monitor. Brandon Warren's second-in-command had agreed to a video call to finalize terms. "We'll issue the public statement by morning," she said. "It will include language approved by our legal counsel and our equity board. We expect it to be on your homepage and pinned across all social media channels within 12 hours of posting." Gregory nodded slowly. "And the training initiative, we're sending over the proposal for your executive DEI overhaul. A full 12-week program, immersive, scenario-based. Every director and above will be required to complete it within 6 months, and the crew, they'll be replaced. But Brandon doesn't want replacements who check boxes. He wants change, from your recruitment to your reward structure." Gregory sighed. "He's essentially reshaping my airline." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "No, Mr. Langston, he's given you a chance to prove you can fly forward instead of backward." He didn't argue. Back in Paris, Celia Warren sat at a small cafe near the riverbank. A waiter with a soft voice poured her more tea. She wore a lavender scarf and soft leather gloves, her expression calm but reflective. A middle-aged woman at the next table recognized her from a news photo circulating online. The woman hesitated, then leaned slightly closer. "Excuse me," she said in a hushed voice. "Are you the woman from the flight?" Celia smiled gently. "That depends which story you've heard." The woman chuckled softly, then said, "The one about the woman who walked away with her head high." Celia's smile deepened. "Then yes," she replied, "that would be me." They spoke for a few minutes, just two strangers sharing an understanding that didn't require grand speeches. When the woman left, she nodded once and said, "You gave people something to believe in." Celia sat there, eyes on the river, as the wind whispered through the leaves. She didn't need to reply. The moment had already spoken for her as Allison sat there. Her mind raced through the years she'd dedicated to the airline. All the birthdays missed, the holidays spent in sky lounges instead of at home, the layovers she turned into rituals of quiet survival. She had thought of herself as professional, efficient, respected. But now, all she could think about was the look on that woman's face, calm, disappointed, and yet resolute. Was there a point where following policy had become more about compliance than compassion? Mark wasn't faring any better. He remembered his own mother, who had worked the night shift as a nurse for most of his childhood. She, too, had once been denied a seat at a charity gala because someone assumed she didn't belong. He had promised himself he'd never become someone who looked through people. And yet, here he was. Their miscalculation hadn't come from malice, but that was no excuse. The systems they upheld were built on quiet, daily decisions like the one they made at Gate 14B. And now, the cracks in that system were visible for the world to see. In the hotel suite back in Paris, Brandon watched the coverage unfold on television. The story had reached national news. Panels of commentators discussed the implications. Civil rights leaders were calling it a pivotal moment in corporate reckoning. Airline stocks had dipped. Statements from senators, activists, and industry analysts crowded his inbox. But Brandon wasn't thinking about press impact or stock shifts. He was thinking about the way his mother carried herself, about how she chose silence over spectacle, dignity over dispute. He closed his laptop and stepped out onto the balcony, where the city stretched endlessly beneath the fading gold of afternoon light. His mother was changing the world, not with a shout, but with a seat, not by staying in it, but by choosing to leave it, and letting the world decide what that meant. As evening settled over the tarmac in London, Nathan O'Hara exited the terminal into the cold night air. His carry-on dragged softly behind him, but something in him felt heavier than his luggage. He had written stories about discrimination before, investigative pieces, editorials, but this was personal. He had seen the moment unfold not as a journalist, but as a man, a witness, a bystander who had done nothing but watch, and that haunted him. He opened his notebook again near a taxi stand and wrote one more sentence. "Silence is complicity dressed in manners." He underlined it, then circled it twice, later that night, across oceans. Celia stood once more at her window. The city lights of Paris shimmered below. She thought of the flight, the faces, the quiet injustice, the quiet power. She didn't feel victorious. She felt reflective, because in the end, it wasn't just about a seat, it was about being seen, and choosing, once and for all, not to shrink to make others more comfortable. She sipped the last of her tea, close the curtains, and let the world continue changing one choice at a time. By the time morning broke over London, Aerosky's public relations team was already 10 hours behind. The social media storm was relentless. It wasn't just the viral clip anymore, it was the ripple. Former flight attendants began anonymously sharing stories. Passengers posted similar encounters. Hashtags multiplied, each more damning than the last. Some were angry, others sorrowful. But all of them echoed the same truth: this wasn't an isolated mistake. Gregory Langston stood in the glass-walled boardroom overlooking Manhattan. The skyline felt like a horizon of judgment. He hadn't slept, not really. Neither had his executive team, who now sat in rows behind laptops, trying to put out digital fires with press statements and templated apologies. He looked at the clock. Brandon Warren's press conference was scheduled in 45 minutes. "You all need to understand something," Gregory said, his voice low but urgent. "This is no longer a reputational crisis. This is systemic exposure." A junior advisor raised her hand. "Sir, do we pull our Heathrow route temporarily?" For optics, Gregory turned slowly to face her. "If we need to ground planes to prove we care about dignity, then we were never in the business of flying people, just managing seats." No one spoke after that. Meanwhile, across town, Allison Shore sat alone at a dimly lit coffee shop near the airport. Her blazer was folded on the seat beside her. She wore no makeup, no lipstick, just herself, stripped of the identity she had wrapped around her job for 22 years. She scrolled through the articles. Flight crew dismissed after first-class incident, a necessary step, power, race, and air travel. What the Celia Warren case exposed: beyond the seat, who gets to belong at 3,000 feet. The headlines made her stomach churn. She had told herself she was being fair, efficient. But now, with distance, she saw the moment for what it truly was: a failure of empathy masquerading as operational protocol. She thought about her own mother, who used to clean hotel lobbies in New Jersey. She had taught Allison to keep her head down, to follow the rules, to be twice as good to be seen as equal. But somewhere along the climb, Allison had forgotten that some rules didn't deserve obedience. Mark Fennell joined her quietly, placing a cup of coffee on the table before sitting across from her. "She was better than both of us," he said. Allison looked up. She didn't even raise her voice. Mark nodded. "That's what makes it worse." They sat in silence for a long time. Not as co-workers, but as people unraveling their own mythologies. In Paris, Brandon Warren stood behind a podium at the Ritz, facing a crowd of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones reached. His tie was navy. His words were measured. "My mother, Celia Warren, is not a political figure. She's not a headline. She's not a spectacle." He paused, letting that sentence land. "She is a retired public librarian. She raised me with decency, taught generations to read, and never once asked to be exceptional just to be treated with basic human dignity." A murmur passed through the room. She was asked to leave her seat in first class not because of an error, not because of a booking issue, but because someone else believed they were more entitled to comfort than she was. He looked directly into the camera, and the crew complied. His voice didn't rise, but the words cut like steel. "This isn't just about my mother. It's about every quiet injustice that's been overlooked in the name of customer satisfaction. Every unspoken moment when someone was made to feel small to keep someone else feeling important." He stepped back, letting the silence fill the room like thunder. In the second row of the press room, a woman named Amina Torres clutched her notepad, trying to keep her emotions steady. A reporter for The Atlantic, she had covered countless corporate apologies over the years, most filled with hollow regret and polished legalese. But this felt different. Brandon's voice didn't quiver. His message wasn't crafted by lawyers. It came from somewhere deeper. Amina found herself blinking back tears, not because of the words, but because she saw her own mother in Celia Warren. Back in New York, a group of college students sat in a campus lounge watching the live feed. Among them was Maya Lynn, a first-generation student from Queens. She nudged her roommate and whispered, "This is going to change things. I can feel it." Her roommate nodded slowly. "It already has." At the same time, a call came through to the newsroom at Global Air Review. The editor-in-chief answered, expecting a routine source. Instead, it was a whistleblower, a former Aerosky executive. "I can't stay quiet anymore," the voice said. "This flight isn't the first time. There are memos, emails, patterns. You want proof of systemic culture, I'll send you everything." They did. The inbox flooded. Policies that prioritized elite passengers even when it compromised ethics. Training manuals with implicit bias built into scenario evaluations. Audio recordings of internal discussions. It was damning. Within hours, investigative reporters began constructing a timeline. What happened to Celia Warren was only the tip of a deeper, more dangerous truth. That night, back in her hotel, Celia turned off the television. She had heard the press conference, seen the reaction, but the weight in her chest hadn't lifted. Brandon entered quietly, placing a blanket over her shoulders. "I'm proud of you," he said gently. She shook her head. "It's not about pride. It's about reckoning." He nodded, sitting beside her. "I just never wanted you to carry the burden alone. You've carried it in other ways," she whispered. "But now the world sees it too." Outside, a crowd had begun to gather below the hotel, not in protest, but in gratitude. Some held flowers, others signs that simply said, "We see you." Celia stepped to the window and watched. She had never asked for attention, but dignity, once seen, had a way of waking others up. Across the world, people were watching, not because of spectacle, but because one woman, quiet and composed, had reminded everyone that the fight for respect doesn't always start with a shout. Sometimes it starts with a seat, and a choice not to give it up, as the evening sky painted streaks of amber over Paris. Celia stepped out onto the hotel terrace. The crowd below had grown, but they remained quiet, respectful. Some simply stood with candles. Others held up book symbols of the life she had lived in quiet service to others. She looked down, not with fear or surprise, but with a gentle recognition. Brandon joined her. "They're here for you." She gave a soft nod. "No, they're here for themselves, for everyone who's ever been told to move aside." For a moment, mother and son stood side by side, watching the movement grow, not as a wave of outrage, but a tide of restoration. And though Celia did not smile, her eyes glistened, because in this moment, the world wasn't asking what seat she sat in. It was asking why it had taken so long to notice she was there. The wind shifted gently, as if carrying her story further into the night sky. She pulled the blanket tighter around her and whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "We are done asking." And finally, she let herself breathe. The corporate offices of Aerosky Airlines felt colder than usual that morning. The sleek glass building, usually a hub of energy and confident decisions, was now filled with hushed conversations and anxious glances. Gregory Langston sat behind his expansive desk, staring at the growing pile of reports on his screen. Every new piece of evidence, every whistleblower email, every anonymous voice made the walls feel smaller and the air heavier. His phone buzzed again. He glanced down. It was Sarah Young. He answered immediately. "Gregory, the board is convening an emergency session this afternoon. They want answers, and they want a plan. The news cycle is unforgiving. The story isn't fading, it's deepening." He rubbed his temples. "Send me the details. I'm on my way." The boardroom was already filling when he arrived. Executives, legal counsel, and PR experts gathered around the polished table, their faces taut with worry. Langston cleared his throat and began. "We underestimated the impact of the Warren incident. It was not an isolated error. It exposed systemic issues embedded in our corporate culture. We are facing a full-scale reckoning." A senior board member leaned forward. "What's the path forward? Do we double down on training or overhaul recruitment?" Langston looked around. "Both, and more. We need a transparency initiative, open forums, accountability metrics tied to every department. Our reputation depends on genuine change. Meanwhile, far from the sterile halls of corporate power." Allison Shore sat quietly in a support group for airline employees. Faces surrounded her, some familiar, others strangers, but all sharing similar stories of quiet struggles behind polished smiles. When it was her turn to speak, Allison's voice trembled but carried weight. "I followed the rules. I thought I was doing my job well, but I realized the rules aren't always right. They don't always protect dignity. I see now how my actions, even if unintentional, contributed to someone's pain." Heads nodded around the circle. An older flight attendant spoke softly. "We have to unlearn to relearn." Allison took a deep breath and added, "I want to be part of the change, but I don't know how to start." Back in Paris, Celia Warren was surrounded by supporters at a small community event celebrating literacy and education. As she addressed the crowd, her voice was steady, carrying years of quiet strength. "This is not just my story," she said. "It belongs to every person who has been overlooked, dismissed, or asked to step aside. When we stand for dignity, we make room for others to stand with us." Brandon watched from the side, pride shining in his eyes. The media continued to buzz. Nathan O'Hara's article had been published online, sparking widespread discussion. His words echoed through social media and newsrooms alike, inspiring more stories of hidden bias and the fight for respect. Whitney Blake, meanwhile, found herself isolated. The backlash was swift. Invitations dried up. Her social circles whispered behind closed doors. She faced a mirror she hadn't seen before, one reflecting entitlement stripped bare. Late one evening, she sat alone, scrolling through messages. A quiet question formed in her mind. How do you rebuild when the world won't let you forget? Across the Atlantic, the winds of change were stirring. Aerosky Airlines was no longer just a company. It was a battleground for cultural transformation. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth: dignity could not be denied forever. The light in Aerosky's conference room was harsher than usual, white and bright. It seemed designed to expose every imperfection, every secret, every uncomfortable truth. Gregory Langston sat at the head of the table, facing a group of executives and diversity consultants. The tension in the room was palpable. "This is the moment," Langston began, his voice steady but grave. "We cannot just react. We must transform. This incident has cracked open a wound in our culture that goes far deeper than any one flight attendant's actions." The consultant, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Hart, nodded thoughtfully. "Culture change is not a checkbox. It is a continuous commitment. It demands vulnerability and accountability at every level." Mark Fennell listened quietly from the back of the room, his eyes heavy with remorse. He had been invited to speak, not just as a representative of the crew, but as someone willing to bear witness to the shortcomings within. When his moment came, Mark took a deep breath. "I spent 20 years believing I was doing right by my passengers. But that day, I failed a guest. I failed someone who deserved dignity and respect. I am ready to learn, to change, and to help Aerosky do the same." A wave of solemn nods followed. Meanwhile, Allison Shore sat in a circle with other employees undergoing the new training program. The sessions were intense immersive role plays, candid discussions, confronting unconscious bias. It was uncomfortable but necessary. One exercise forced participants to walk a mile in the shoes of passengers who had faced microaggressions or outright discrimination. Allison remembered how hard it was to listen without defending, to feel the sting of indignity without deflecting. After a long day, she sat alone in the lounge, reflecting on her own journey. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. Back in Paris. Celia Warren walked through the gardens near her hotel, the scent of blooming roses heavy in the air. The weight of the past days pressed gently but insistently on her shoulders. A young woman approached her, holding a small book. "Mrs. Warren," she said softly, "your story has inspired me. I'm starting a community project to help kids learn to advocate for themselves." Celia smiled warmly. "That's the most beautiful response I could hope for. Change starts with one voice and grows with many." Across the Atlantic, Nathan O'Hara published a follow-up column titled "Dignity's Demand." It became a rallying cry for social justice advocates, a call to recognize the humanity in every passenger, employee, and leader. Whitney Blake, in contrast, found herself at a crossroads. The fallout had dismantled the life she had built around status and privilege. Late one night, she sat before her mirror, confronting a face she barely recognized. The question wasn't just how to repair her public image, but whether she wanted to. The journey was no longer about entitlement. It was about reckoning with herself, her choices, and the legacy she wished to leave. As Aerosky Airlines embraced the difficult work of transformation, one thing became clear: the seat was never just about comfort. It was about respect, equity, and the courage to stand for what is right. And sometimes, the most powerful changes begin with a simple refusal to move. The months that followed transformed Aerosky Airlines in ways few imagined possible. What began as a moment of conflict had evolved into a catalyst for change that rippled through every corner of the company. Gregory Langston stood once again before the board, this time presenting results not just of damage control, but of genuine progress. "We have launched the most comprehensive cultural overhaul in our history," he said. "Training programs have been completed by 98% of staff. Recruitment policies are being rewritten to prioritize inclusivity. Our employee feedback scores show a measurable shift in workplace environment. Sarah Young, seated beside him, added, "The journey is ongoing, but the trajectory is clear. We are committed to ensuring no passenger ever feels invisible or disposable." Across the globe. Brandon Warren watched with quiet satisfaction as his mother's story became a beacon for dignity and justice. But more than that, it was the small victories that mattered, the letters from passengers thanking the airline for listening, the reports of staff stepping up to create more welcoming experiences, the initiatives led by employees who refused to accept the old ways. Celia herself had settled into a quieter rhythm, but remained engaged. She had become a consultant for community outreach programs, traveling between cities to share her story and encourage others to speak up. At a library in Brooklyn, she was surrounded by children as she read aloud, her voice steady and warm. Afterward, a young girl tugged on her sleeve. "Mrs. Warren," she said, eyes wide, "do you think I could be brave like you someday?" Celia smiled and reached out to take her hand. Bravery comes in many forms. Sometimes it's in standing firm. Sometimes it's in speaking softly but with strength. And sometimes it's simply in knowing you deserve respect. Back at Aerosky, Allison Shore was now leading workshops on empathy and de-escalation, sharing her own story of transformation. Mark Fennell worked with HR to develop peer support programs, helping crew members navigate the complexities of their roles with compassion. Whitney Blake, having faced her own reckoning, quietly withdrew from public view. She sought counseling and began volunteering with organizations focused on equity and inclusion. It was not redemption for her, but a beginning of understanding. Nathan O'Hara's columns continued to challenge society's complacency, reminding readers that dignity is not negotiable and that change often begins at eye level. One evening, as Celia and Brandon strolled through the gardens of Hyde Park, their conversation was light but underscored by the weight of recent events. "You changed more than just an airline, Ma," Brandon said softly. "You changed how people see themselves." Celia looked up at the London sky, streaked with fading sunlight. "Maybe," she said, "but the real change comes when the next person takes that courage and uses it. That's the legacy we leave." She paused and smiled gently. The seat we refused to give up was never about comfort. It was about dignity. And once that truth is clear, nothing can take it away. Brandon squeezed her hand. "No, nothing can." As the city lights twinkled around them, a quiet truth settled between mother and son. Sometimes, the smallest act of standing firm becomes the beginning of a journey that changes everything. The flight path was new now, one guided not by privilege or entitlement, but by respect, empathy, and unyielding courage. And it all began with a simple, dignified no. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the story of Celia Warren, a woman who reminded the world that dignity is not negotiable and that respect must be earned and given to all, regardless of age, race, or seat number. Her quiet strength sparked a reckoning that no amount of power or privilege could silence. But let this story also be a call to all of us to recognize the subtle and not so subtle ways discrimination still shows up in everyday places, even 40,000 feet above the ground. We must stand together, speak up, and demand change where it is long overdue. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, please give this video a thumbs up, share it widely to raise awareness, and subscribe to our channel. We have many more true stories that shine a light on injustice, courage, and the fight for dignity. Together, we can make sure these stories are heard, lessons are learned, and the skies become a place of respect for everyone. See you in the next video. Stay strong and keep standing for what is right.